afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Hanna. I am a cooperating attorney at the ACLU. I also serve as the president of the Next Generation Society there. It's a pleasure to have you all and a pleasure to have this distinguished panel to talk about how we can empower every American's voice and why every American's voice should be empowered, and look at communities that haven't had their voices empowered and what we need to do and are doing to give strength to those voices. So we only have a half hour, so I'd like to start with just doing a quick round of introductions from the panel.
Lina, sergie-attar, Karam Foundation.
Emma, Ruby-Sachs, Avaaz.
Marya, Bangee with Harness.
Glynda, Carr from Higher Heights for America.
Marissa McBride with the Voter Participation Center.
Nice to meet you all, and nice to have you here. So I wanted to start the conversation by asking, when did you first discover your own voice in the political story that you're now in? Maybe start with you.
I discovered my voice as a Syrian American really years before the conflict began, and living both in America and growing up in Syria, it really affected me knowing the values of both countries, of your parents' homeland and being American. And when we watched the revolution unfold as part of the Arab Spring in 2011, it really became something that kind of, for me, joined both worlds together in a very powerful way. But the sad part is that nobody had predicted that this conflict would create the largest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime, and that's when we began to become activists and began to become actors within this space, which we had never expected to have to be in. And so there's part of it that was fate, and part of it that was choice, and part of it that's just really responsibility.
And before we move on to the other panelists, can you tell the folks here about the Karam Foundation?
Karam Foundation is an organization we started in Chicago in 2007, and Karam means generosity in Arabic. And the work that we do now is focused on helping Syrian refugee youth and families build their own futures. Our work is in Syria, in Turkey, with a lot of different youth, doing innovative education programming and supporting families. And we're also active within the US, working with refugee families in Chicago, Boston, and in Michigan, rebuild their lives and jumpstart their lives. We believe in the concept of smart aid, which is aid that is community-driven, and we believe in co-authoring all of our programs with the communities that we serve. We're small, but we have a big impact, and we're growing. We just wish that this conflict would end, and that's where we need a lot of political will from the entire world and the international community, and especially the United States, which we're not seeing, because this crisis won't end, the refugee crisis won't end unless the war ends inside Syria.
Have you experienced challenges in trying to get Americans to speak their voice about the humanitarian crisis and to get their representatives more and more involved?
Absolutely. The problem with the Syrian war and the conflict and the crisis is that people do get engaged, and we have seen global compassion towards the refugee crisis, but it's very short-lived. This is the downside of social media activism and hashtags and viral photographs that all of you, I'm sure, know the viral photographs of children of Syria. But the problem is that people get really energized and affected and compassionate for a brief amount of time, and because if we don't see that Syria is in the news every day, we forget that the conflict is ongoing. And so it's easy to say, you know what, it's been going on so long, we don't understand it, it's too complicated, and it's easy for the public to disengage until the next viral image comes out and the whole thing starts over again. But these kinds of conflicts are long-term, and they need a sustained amount of attention, and it is genocide happening on our watch. And every single day, people, women, children are dying in Syria and being killed unnecessarily in this genocide every single day, including today, by bombing, by starvation, by all different kinds of atrocities. And we have to continue to pay attention, even if it's not in the news and not right on the front pages.
And one thing I should just point out for the audience and everyone watching is that we have a lot of really compelling interests represented here. Obviously Syria, global warming, advancing black women's rights, and moving them up in the workplace. So we have a broad canvas of issues and topics in a very short amount of time. So try to distribute it a little bit. Marya, we were talking right before the meeting, the panel, about the importance of this moment in history and the importance of bringing out the voices of every American to address this array of topics and focus on it. What have you done in your life in your career to make that happen?
Yeah, so I'm with Harness, which was an organization founded after the election by America Ferrera and Wilmer Valderrama and several other kind of folks in Hollywood. And the understanding was that in this political moment, what we're really seeing is an administration that is using culture very effectively to shape a narrative about what it means to be an American and what is America. And who fits into that narrative. And really for folks within the entertainment industry to really think through how is it that we can start to center and uplift the voices of vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable communities so that we can really shift the way that people are thinking about the world. And we do that through conversations with showrunners and with studios and networks and also with celebrities on how they can use their platforms to really uplift the voices of communities. And I think the reason why that's really important is because popular culture informs the way we understand the world and the way we understand each other. And if we don't understand that, like, this is the moment to see how we are struggling over our values as a country, right? And we're seeing Trump specifically use his platform to shape the way that people understand each other and understand their place in this country. And so for us to center and really amplify the voices of the people that are being most impacted in a human way, not in a political way. So for example, we had an event where we amplified the voice of Gaston Cesares, who's an undocumented immigrant who was deported. And we worked with Now This and we worked with NBC and Hearst Magazine to push out his story to millions of people. But the reason why we did that was not because, at the end of the day, this is a political issue, but because every political issue has a human cost. And so for us to really make sure that we are uplifting the stories of people is crucial.
What have you found to be most effective in changing the narrative from what we often see is kind of comes down from this administration and from more entrenched powers, maybe powers that have a lot more experience driving the narrative and maybe have the loudest voice in the room? How have you tried to overcome that? What methods would you advise that we, just in our day-to-day lives, follow to get over that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing is that when we come from a place of, like, we should do this or judgment when we're trying to have a conversation, it can be really difficult. So for example, a lot of the folks that we work with are already people who have progressive values, right? But we walk into a room and we say, you need to do this, and that conversation doesn't go anywhere. Versus like really making sure that people are sitting and engaging with each other face to face and having the space to ask questions and have difficult conversations. To us, that has been a much more effective way of engaging. The other thing I would say is that everybody in this room, like many of you have platforms and you have skill sets that you can bring in terms of being able to amplify voices. And so how is it that you, number one, are going outside of your comfort zone? How are you getting to engage with communities that you would never be a part of? And how are you then using that and using your skill set to start to create this narrative? Because we are in an incredible time where we're in the wild west of new media. It's an extremely democratic platform. Part of the struggle that we're having is that fake news and all of these things are becoming viral. That's actually shaping the way people think in a way that's harmful because it's not grounded in reality. But how is it that we can start to think about using things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, as well as traditional media like the news media and the studios and things like that, to start to shape the way that we tell each other's stories and the way that we connect and engage with each other. And having kind of like humility and space in those conversations to allow for us to really be vulnerable and to really connect.
And in the face of, I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about climate. Emma, in the face of the fake news and the narrative being so skewed towards people in leadership positions who deny the very possibility of climate change, how do you take that and actually speak truth to power when there is no real microphone, or the microphone is distributed among several million people, on Twitter and Facebook. How do you unite that into a voice just as loud?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a couple things I would say. The first is that we have to know that we are the majority, right? Like the majority of the people in this country do believe in like things like climate change. I think that the voices that are the loudest are people that are pushing a specific agenda and a specific kind of like perspective. And to understand that that came from a groundwork that was laid over like 4 or 5 years, right? And so we can't expect to change the conversation overnight. Yes, we can, uplift and continue to push back and really start to advocate for the things we believe in, but I think this is like a long-term strategy. When we talk about culture shift work, so for example, we got, through the work that we're doing with NBC and other studios, we got different characters into some of the most highly watched shows in broadcast television this fall, right? Which is an incredible achievement. People that have never been on television, communities that have never been on television are gonna be on television this fall. However, that's just one piece. When you're talking about culture shift, it's like you need critical mass. You need everybody to be expressing their voice, right? And so for us to think through how is it that they've built a base, they've like cultivated that base through radio shows, through Fox News, et cetera, and how can we start to think in similar ways about starting those conversations in our local communities and then building that up to like a national conversation.
Shifting gears slightly, Glynda, can you tell us a little bit about Higher Heights, just what you've been doing there and how you've given people voices?
Sure. I love the first question you asked, which was, what was the first time you realized kind of your voice mattered? And I always go to, I am the great-granddaughter of Carrie Lee Dickens. Here's a woman that was born in 1895 and died shy of her 100th birthday. She didn't have a right to vote. She wasn't supposed to own property, had a third-grade education, but she dreamt a dream bigger for me than I could have imagined. She dreamt of a world that didn't have walls and ceilings, and that for me to have a seat at a table to be able to move this country forward. So my voice comes from that history, because I know that Black women lead. We started at Higher Heights in 2011 in a Brooklyn cafe, and the notion was, how do you harness and untap the organizing power of Black women from the voting booth to elected office. And I think we all agreed. We woke up on November 9th stunned. But the one thing that resolved kind of in November 9th for me last year was that Black women continue to do what we've always done. We voted 94% to move this country forward. And at a time where we lost from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket, Black women broke through on the ballot. We have the largest number of Black women serving in Congress, the largest number of Black women serving in state legislatures, but yet the 23 million Black women in this country are underrepresented and underserved. So Higher Heights is building a national network of Black women and our allies to absolutely untap and unleash our organizing power. What you probably remembered in 2008 and 2012, that when you fire up a Black woman, she doesn't go to the polls alone. She brings her block, her house, her block, her church, and her sorority. So the question becomes, and I particularly like the conversation here, is how do we use our innovative technology to give Black women the tools to run, win, and lead? Black women, according to Nielsen, are considered trendsetters. Black women spend twice as much time on social media. We click through more videos than the average population. And like I said, until the day my mother died, she called myself and my brothers every election and said, "Did you vote?" So how do you take the best return on the investment for the progressive community by investing and harnessing Black women's political potential to do two things: change the face of our democracy. According to the Women's Donor Network, white men have 3 times more political power than women, and they have 8 times more political power than women of color. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a civil rights activist, an everyday woman, sat in a back of a church and was fired up, not only to step off the sidelines and register her neighbors, but became one of the most iconic civil rights leaders of our history. Little people don't know that she actually ran for Congress. And her thought was pushing the Democratic Party to say that people that looked like her, talked like her, and came from her background should have seats at the table. She once said, it's time for America to get it right. And that resonates right now, that it's time for America to get it right, and to get it right brings you to a Shirley Chisholm quote, which is, if there isn't a chair at the table, we need to say, ladies, we need to bring our chairs and say, scoot over. And so that's our work, is harnessing the millions of voices, votes, and economic power to be able to help shape and move this country forward.
Have you ever found yourself in a position where you had to convince someone that they have a voice in the first place?
Yes. So I always say that you can't harness power you don't know you have. And I'd say an average black woman, because that's the constituency we work with, from my cousin from around the way to my affluent best friend, they don't think their vote matters. Yet and still, black women have decided elections. I have a good friend who's a state senator in New York. She lost her election by 18 votes. Looking at last election cycles, if we were just able to bring out a couple of more people in critical places, the person in the White House would look totally different than who's there. So it is being able to say, our money matters. Black women control $565 billion a year. Imagine if we just shifted some of that economic power to our political stewardship. Absolutely control, decide elections on the national level. And that when you talk about taking that national influence and power and translating it to a local elections, black women can change the face of our democracy. And then finally, how do we use our online power, as we've done with the Black Lives Matter movement, Say Her Name movement, the Me Too hashtag moment, to then be able to harness the voices and the influence that we have on individuals to activate and around issues and elections.
Marissa, you do work with voters.
Yes, we work with the Voter Participation Center. I'm going to echo a lot of what you just said. The populations that we focus on are unmarried women, communities of color, and millennial voters. They're traditionally underrepresented and underserved in our democracy. So we run large-scale registration and turnout programs to basically amplify their voices and realize that the policy debates that are happening right now, they disproportionately affect the people that we care about, but they do have a voice and they can make a difference. But the first step to that is actually registering and then turning out to vote. So that's what our programs are designed to do.
How much tailoring of your message to different demographics do you do to, I guess, get the maximum volume out of different groups' voices?
Quite a bit. I think our registration work is very, very much plain Jane, because a lot of people don't like to mix their politics with their registration, which is odd for us, but it's been proven. But in terms of our GOTV work, a lot of our social pressure mail and just the GOTV work we're doing in general is tailored to demographic, also geographies as well. Like, we want to know what's moving people in Wisconsin versus what's moving people in Florida and across the country, and make sure that we're speaking directly to them about the issues that are most resonant with them, and in a way that that also resonates with them as well.
And what sort of feedback do you get from people who you've helped empower to actually speak their voice and go to the polls and see actual change?
Well, I think one of the best things that we've seen, and we've studied this over the past few cycles, is watching the people that we brought on in a midterm, 8 years ago, continue to vote, right? And turning them over to the groups on the ground and seeing how they're working within their communities to both register people in their communities, advocate around the issues that are important to them, but also just become a habitual voter and somebody who sees themselves in the process. I think that's been the most rewarding piece, and that's something that we're going to continue to track, through the 18 midterms and obviously into 2020 as well.
There's only one person who hasn't spoken yet. We have 5 more minutes, and I've saved the toughest question of all for her. Why is this moment in time in America's history more important than any other for Americans to have a voice and to speak it?
You asked the Canadian that question? That was really unfair.
Saved it just for you.
So just when talking about my perspective, I'm a deputy director of a group called Avaaz, which is a 45 million person global advocacy movement. And we have 2 million members in the US, but a lot of my work is looking at what role the US plays on the global stage. And I'm always thinking about the role that it's playing in leadership and detraction. And so there's the classic answer, right? Which is that we're more connected than we've ever been, and that what happens in a particular country affects everyone. We go to nuclear war, we're all screwed. We pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. What does that do to the air quality for all of humanity? What does that do about the timelines and horizons we see, our hope for our kids? And I think the US is, in some ways, absolutely essential and critical to global movement, and that's why I think it's a critical moment. At the same time, I look at what's happening in the US, and I, as a student of history, think about, the very first social movement around the abolition of slavery in the UK, and was that a more critical moment for social activism? I think about the civil rights movement in the US, and was that really actually a more critical moment? I don't know that I would say this is the most important time in US history. And then when I look at the global arc, I see Germany rising. I see China rising for better or worse, and in some ways in really hopeful ways. Like, China has a much more ambitious climate plan than the US does. What does that say about the way the world's organized right now? Angela Merkel, might be the Mandela of our generation. What does that say about the way the world's organized now? So I would say there's great opportunity in the US right now. People are looking to see what we are going to do together, how we're going to re-architect ourselves. Is this going to be one of those critical moments I'm going to tell my kid olden day stories about, like the civil rights movement, like what my parents told me about the civil rights movement? That would be incredible. That opportunity is there for us to grasp. Whether we go there is an open question, I think, right now.
Can you tell us about the first time you found your own voice, especially when it comes to concern about climate?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was like the loud loser in the back of the classroom no one wanted to be friends with. So I would say I had the unfortunate lack of social skills to always have a voice and not use it effectively. But my journey, I was a lawyer, and then I wrote a novel, and then I ran out of money living in New York and got this job. And it's done something different. My voice is now not my own. I represent this huge number of people all over the world, and that, the way it's gotten rid of a kind of personal sense of loneliness is kind of transformative, and a new sense of purpose. That you look at global polling, and we fundamentally agree as a global community about way more than we disagree on. And my job is to tell that story over and over and over again for the millions of people who have 2 kids and 2 jobs and only can interact for a minute here and a minute there. So you look at something like Syria, yes, people engage in key moments when they see a media story, because that's what draws us from just the job of living. But I get to go into all the meetings and do the analysis and keep pushing that forward, so that when you put your kids to bed at night, you can kind of trust that there's some leadership out there making sure that your voice is heard, even when you're just doing the stuff of getting through life. So yeah, I guess in some ways I've lost my individual voice in a really beautiful way.
I think we can close on one somewhat controversial question that goes to the opposite end. We all are familiar with the awful events in Charlottesville, and at the core of that was actually a group that wanted to file a permit to protest, and initially that permit was denied by the city of Charlottesville, and one group was asked to move and the counter-protesters were asked to stay, which is why ultimately it was clearly a violation of free speech rights under the First Amendment. So for whomever wants to take this question, is there a limit to, to voice that you think that would make sense when that voice is actually a voice for regression and chaos and some of the stuff that we saw in Charlottesville? Is there a meaningful balance in your mind where those voices should be, limited?
I'm happy to wade into this one, which I can imagine is super controversial, but I get to lie back on the global context, which is that most of the world has free speech limits that have to do with hate speech.
Yeah.
And that's actually common, my home country has it, all over Europe they have it. And I've used those laws in campaigning a lot to our advantage, to be able to, deal with more media plurality, make sure that other voices are heard, that those voices aren't the loudest ones in the room. I'm not sure it's a good thing. I'm not sure the US isn't getting it right, as messy and terrible as it is. And you work for the ACLU, so you guys have.
No, I'm a cooperating attorney. And
okay, sorry. Don't want to paint you with that brush.
Yeah.
But in Illinois, there's this long history of the ACLU in Illinois that took on the right of Nazis to protest, and it was very controversial. And then when I moved here, I heard stories about it. And I would just say, being a beacon for free speech in the world, as controversial and terrifying as it is, might be a great thing. And I haven't seen huge progress in the elimination of the far right in Europe, for example. It's not like Germany, the Nazi party, essentially the Nazi party, is now, a significant force in the Bundestag, despite laws saying they're not allowed to communicate. So I'm not sure it's a good thing to put those limits on in terms of actual political progress.
I would just add two things to that. The first is to your previous point about is this the most important moment in history? And I agree with what you're saying, but I also think we need to be called to take on the movements that were created before and recreate them. And I think that this is a moment for us to really stand up and speak out and exercise our principles. And I think that then we can galvanize this to be a crucial moment in US history. And it is in some ways in terms of repressing rights. And then the other thing I would say about freedom of speech is that we don't talk enough about how technology has accelerated the increase of hate speech and of false information. And I do think that there has to be conversations about responsibility and accountability online. We have these incredibly powerful media platforms that are virtually unchecked, and I do think that there is a problem there. So I don't have a solution for that, but I think we need to have more vigorous and robust conversation around responsibility with those things.
And there is a global solution to that, which Germany actually is pushing. I don't want to talk too much about it, but this idea that the algorithms you put out there are a kind of speech and that you are responsible for the speech that it promotes. And I think the idea of holding people accountable for their algorithms is genius, and I would love to see that all over the world. As soon as we get time to breathe, I'm sure we'll all be moving in that direction in our campaigning.
Well, we could certainly sit up here for a lot longer, but we're a little bit over time. I would just open up to the audience. If anyone does have any questions, we might have a couple of minutes for one. It's too bright for me to see any hands, but I'll assume there aren't any. So thank you all for your time, and thank you, panel, for a great conversation.